The HOA dragged me into a Cherokee County courtroom to force me to tear down a fence I'd built on my own land. Their president, Brenda Caldwell, sat across the aisle in a cream linen blazer, smiling like she'd already won. To her, I was just a stubborn black man with no lawyer and no chance. She'd fined me $200 a day, smeared me to the whole neighborhood, and sent men with a crowbar in the dark. What she didn't know was sitting in the folder under my hands. She didn't know that land was my grandfather's stolen 60 years ago and finally bought back. And she had no idea that in about 90 seconds, the judge was going to read one sentence out loud, and her smile would freeze and never quite come back. Where are you watching from tonight? Stay with me, because this is what happens when petty power picks the wrong man. Let me back up 4 months to the day the trouble found me. My name is Nathaniel Brooks. Most folks call me Nate. For 22 years, I wore the uniform as an Army JAG officer, which is a fancy way of saying I was a lawyer who happened to salute. I retired a lieutenant colonel, hung up the dress greens, and went into private practice doing the quietest, least glamorous work there is: land law. Deeds, plats, easements, boundary lines. The stuff nobody thinks about until it's the only thing that matters. I came back to Cherokee County for one reason. My grandfather, Ezra Brooks, once owned 4 acres of red Georgia clay off a gravel road north of Atlanta. He farmed it, raised my father on it, and meant to pass it down. In 1961, a man with a county connection and a smooth voice talked him out of it, for pennies. The way they did to a lot of black families back then. A signature here, a threat there, and 3 generations of roots were gone in an afternoon. Ezra never stopped grieving that land. He'd drive past it sometimes, slow, and not say a word the rest of the day. So when those 4 acres came up for sale last spring, I emptied a good chunk of my savings and bought them back. I stood in the middle of that field alone, and I cried like a child. 40 years late, but the Brooks name was on the deed again. The soil there has a smell after rain, iron and clay and pine, and it smelled like the stories my grandfather used to tell on his porch. Cicadas rang in the tree lines so loud you could feel it in your teeth. A red-tailed hawk worked slow circles over the pasture every morning, like it was inspecting my progress. I cleared a building site, pulled my permits at the county office, every one of them stamped and filed, and put up a cedar privacy fence along my own property line. Good lumber, square posts set in concrete. I sank those posts myself, one shovelful of red clay at a time, sweat stinging my eyes. The thing was beautiful, and it was mine. I'd had it up about 3 days when the pearl-white Lexus rolled to a stop on the gravel. The woman who climbed out moved like she owned the road, the trees, and the sky above them. Blonde, polished sunglasses worth more than my first car. She introduced herself as Brenda Caldwell, president of the Magnolia Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and she said the word president the way some people say doctor. "We're so glad to have new people," she said, smiling without warmth. "But sweetheart, that fence is going to have to come down." I asked her why. It wasn't approved by the architectural committee. She was already sliding a printed notice under my windshield wiper. "We have standards here. I'm sure you understand." I understood plenty. I'd seen that smile before in courtrooms and on base. The smile of someone who has decided what you are before you open your mouth. But I'm a patient man. My grandfather taught me that the loudest person in the room is almost never the one holding the winning card. So I just nodded, took the notice, and said, "I'll look into it." I sat in my truck a long minute after she left the notice in my lap, the engine ticking as it cooled. My late wife Carol used to say I had 2 speeds, quiet and quieter, and that the quiet one was the one to watch out for. She'd have liked this land. She'd have hated that woman. I missed her right then with a sharpness that surprised me. She drove off, pleased, certain she'd handled me. That fence wasn't only cedar and nails, it was 40 years of a stolen dream finally set right, and the first good thing I'd built since I'd buried the woman I loved. And Brenda Caldwell had just decided to make it her business to tear it down. The notices came like weather. The first said my fence was the wrong color. The second said it exceeded a height limit. The third claimed it disrupted community aesthetic harmony, which is a lot of words to describe a clean cedar fence on private land. Each one carried a fine. $50 a day, the paper warned, compounding until I achieved compliance. I kept every single notice. I bought a cheap accordion file and labeled the tabs by date. Old habit from the Army paper outlives memory, and a documented record outlives a loud opinion. Every time one of those slips appeared, I photographed it, where it sat, time-stamped, before I touched it. By the end of the second week, I had 11 of them, a fat little stack held together with a binder clip, each one angrier than the last. What struck me was the pattern. Across the road, a white neighbor had a chain-link fence going gray with age and a boat on blocks in his side yard. Never a notice. 2 doors down, a trampoline sat rusting in plain view of the street. Never a notice. But my brand new cedar fence, built straight and clean, on land I'd surveyed myself, somehow threatened the very soul of the neighborhood. I noticed. I wrote that down too. Then the trucks started coming. I came home one afternoon to find a man in a polo shirt crouched at my fence line with a tape measure scribbling on a clipboard. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't called. He was just standing on my grass like it was his. "Help you," I said. He startled, then puffed up the way small men do. "HOA inspection. Mrs. Caldwell sent me." "This is private property," I told him, keeping my voice flat and easy. "You're going to want to step back across that line." "I'm authorized." "You're not," I said. "Not on my land. Step back." He left muttering something about my attitude. I watched his truck kick up a tail of red dust down the gravel road. That night I mounted 2 weatherproof cameras, one at the gate and one at the corner post, running cable in the dark while moths batted at my work light. If people were going to keep walking onto my land, I wanted a record of every footstep. The little red lights blinked in the dark like patient eyes. I didn't know yet just how much they were going to see. But here's the thing that started itching at me. I'm a land lawyer. I read covenants for a living. So I sent the HOA a simple written request. Please identify the specific recorded provision my fence violates and provide the document where it appears. A covenant isn't magic. For it to bind your land, it has to be recorded against your property in the county deed records. It has to actually exist in writing, attached to your parcel. That's not a loophole. That's the whole foundation of how this works. The HOA's response came a week later, on heavy letterhead embossed and important looking. It was 2 paragraphs of bluster about community standards and the spirit of the neighborhood. It used the word reasonable 3 times and the word expectation twice. It quoted feelings. It quoted Brenda. What it did not quote, not once, was a single recorded provision with a section number I could look up. No article, no paragraph, no citation a court could test. I read that letter twice standing at my kitchen counter, while the coffee went cold and bitter in my hand. They couldn't cite the rule. They could only cite themselves. I want you to understand why that mattered so much, because it's the kind of thing most people never get told. An HOA's power isn't magic, and it isn't unlimited. It comes from one place, a recorded document filed at the courthouse that names your land and binds it to the rules. No recorded document, no power. A board can shout community standards until they're hoarse, but if they can't point to the page, the paragraph, the line, then all that authority is a costume, and costumes come off. Most folks would have gotten angrier. I got quieter. Because a person who's sure of their authority shows you the document. A person who's bluffing shows you their chest. Brenda Caldwell had just shown me her chest. And somewhere under all that linen, I started to suspect there was nothing holding it up. I slid the letter into the accordion file under a fresh tab. Then I drove to the county courthouse and asked the clerk a very ordinary question that was about to unravel everything. Before I could get my answer at the courthouse, Brenda escalated. Magnolia Ridge held its monthly meeting in the clubhouse, a low brick building that smelled of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. I went because a man should look his accusers in the eye. I sat in a folding chair in the back while Brenda ran the room like a queen, holding court gavel in one hand, sweet tea in the other. When my name came up, she didn't even pretend. "We have a property owner," she announced, "who thinks the rules don't apply to him, who built an unpermitted eyesore, who is dragging down every home value on this street." She let her eyes find me in the back row. "Some people just don't share our standards." The room shifted. A few neighbors I'd waved to on morning walks suddenly found their shoes very interesting. That's how it works. You don't need a slur when a tone will do. You just say, "our standards," and let everyone fill in the blank. A heavy-set man beside me leaned over and whispered, not unkindly, "She does this. Pick somebody every year. Last year it was the family with the wrong mailbox." He shook his head. Easier to just give her what she wants. Then he caught himself talking to me and turned back around like sympathy itself was a finable offense. The board voted that night to raise my fines to $200 a day and to revoke my amenity privileges. I almost laughed. I'd never used their cracked pool or their sad little tennis court in my life. But the message wasn't about tennis. It was about putting me in a box marked outsider and nailing the lid. I didn't shout. I raised my hand during the open comment period and asked one question, calm as Sunday. "Madam President, under the Georgia Property Owners Association Act, a member is entitled to inspect the association's records. I'd like to formally request the recorded covenants and the financial books." You'd have thought I'd cursed in church. Brenda's smile cracked at one corner. "Those are internal documents." "They're not," I said. "They're records you're required to make available. I'll put the request in writing tonight." In Georgia, like a lot of states, a homeowner has a statutory right to inspect association records, the governing documents, and the financials, both. They can't just wave you off because they don't like your face. Brenda knew it too, because her husband Gerald sat 2 seats down, and when I said the word financial, his head came up like a deer hearing a twig snap. He was a soft gray man in a golf shirt, the kind who fades into a room. But for 1 second, his eyes locked on mine, and there wasn't entitlement in them. There was fear. I filed it like that mattered. Most people would have stormed out of that meeting shouting. I walked out smiling, and went home and typed a 1-page records request, calm and precise, citing the statute by number. I filed it that evening, certified mail, return receipt. Paper outlives memory, and I learned a long time ago that a written request you can prove they received is worth more than an hour of yelling they can pretend never happened. 3 days later, a man caught me in the courthouse parking lot, thin, nervous, mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair. He introduced himself as Tom Whitfield, the HOA treasurer, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like a man crossing a border. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I shouldn't be talking to you." He pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand. "But you should pull the original subdivision plat, the 1968 one. Look at the legal description. Look real careful at the boundary." Then he walked off fast before I could even ask his name twice. I stood there in the heat with that paper burning a hole in my palm, gravel ticking under a passing car. I unfolded it, one line in shaky handwriting. "Your land was never in it." I read those 5 words maybe 10 times. The cicadas screamed in the oaks along the courthouse lawn. And for the first time in 4 months, I felt the ground shift not under me, but under Brenda Caldwell. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my tailgate under a sky thick with stars, the metal still warm from the day, and I let myself think about what Tom Whitfield was so afraid of. A treasurer doesn't whisper warnings in parking lots over a fence. A treasurer whispers when he's seen the books. Whatever was wrong here, it was bigger than cedar and paint color, and a man that's scared doesn't take a risk like that unless his conscience has been keeping him up at night too. I made a note to be kind to Tom Whitfield when the time came. Frightened men who finally tell the truth deserve a soft place to land. Brenda didn't wait for the records request. She went nuclear instead. I got served on a Tuesday. A process server in a sweat-soaked shirt handed me a thick envelope on my own front step. Magnolia Ridge Estates Homeowners Association versus Nathaniel Brooks. They were suing me to compel removal of the fence, plus the accumulated fines, plus their attorney's fees. They'd hired a lawyer named Bradley Foss, a man with a courthouse handshake and a billboard near the interstate. And Brenda Lord. Brenda threw herself a little press event over it. She stood at the stone entrance sign of the subdivision, gathered 3 local reporters and a handful of supporters, and gave a speech about defending community standards against those who refuse to respect them. She wore pearls. She had talking points. She called me without naming me an out-of-towner who thinks he's above the rules. Behind her, a man held a hand-lettered sign that read, "Rules are rules." I almost felt sorry for them. A neighbor sent me the video. I watched it twice, sitting in my truck with the windows down, the heat shimmering off the hood, a mockingbird running through its whole catalog in the oak overhead. My hands were steady on the wheel. I'd learned long ago that anger you can't aim is just noise. Anger you can file is a weapon. Here's what Brenda didn't know. She thought she was crushing a stubborn handyman. She had no idea that the man she'd just dragged into court spent 2 decades practicing exactly this kind of law, that I'd cross-examined colonels and won, that I read covenants the way she read the social calendar. She'd brought a butter knife to a gunfight, and she'd done it on the one battlefield where I was most at home. She thought a lawsuit was a threat. To me, a lawsuit was an open door. Because the moment they filed suit, they handed me something they could never take back. Discovery. The legal right to demand documents to put people under oath, to crack open the books Brenda had spent years keeping shut. She thought she was attacking me. She'd actually just kicked down her own front door and invited me in. Let me explain what most people don't realize about getting sued, because it's the part that changes everything. A lawsuit isn't a one-way punch. The second you file one, you swing the doors open on yourself. The other side gets to demand your records, depose your friends, subpoena your bank. Brenda had spent years deciding what the neighborhood was allowed to see. By dragging me into court, she just signed away that power to me. From that day forward, I got to ask the questions. And I had a great many questions about where the money went. I didn't smile much those days, but sitting in that truck, I did. That weekend, an old man ambled up my gravel drive with a rolled tube of paper under one arm and a straw hat on his head. Walter Greer, 81 years old, lived 3 lots down and had spent 40 years as a licensed land surveyor before he retired. "Heard what that woman's doing to you," Walter said, and spat into the clay. "Knew your granddaddy a little. Ezra was a good man." He tapped the tube against his palm. "I kept copies of every survey I ever ran in this county, including the one for Magnolia Ridge when they platted it. Son, I think you're going to want to see where they drew the line." I made us both iced tea, sweet and cold beating in the glasses. We unrolled his survey across my kitchen table and weighed the corners down with coffee mugs. The paper smelled like a dusty attic, like decades, and the ink had gone soft brown with age. Walter put one crooked finger on the map, traced the boundary of the subdivision, and stopped at a notch cut into the southwest corner. A 4-acre notch. My notch. My grandfather's land sitting just outside the line, like a stone the river had refused to swallow. "They platted right around you," Walter said softly. "Always did. Developer back then didn't want to mess with a clouded title, so he just drew the subdivision line to dodge your granddaddy's piece. Your land was never part of that subdivision. Not in '68, not ever." He tapped the notch twice. "Whoever's telling you that you owe this HOA anything is lying to your face, son. I drew this line myself." I looked at that little notch on the map. For 40 years it had been the shape of my family's loss, a piece carved out and left behind. Now it was something else entirely. Now it was the one fact that no amount of linen blazers and embossed letterhead could argue away. 40 years of family grief turned very quietly into a key, and I knew exactly which lock it opened. Monday morning I was at the county deed room when it opened, and my daughter Simone was with me. Simone's a second-year law student, sharp as a fresh blade, and she'd driven down from Athens the second she heard a fight was on. We pulled the recorded documents one by one. The original 1968 plat, the Declaration of Covenants, every amendment Magnolia Ridge had ever filed. The deed room was cold and silent, except for the hum of the microfilm reader and the click of Simone's pen. A Declaration of Covenants has a legal description attached. It spells out in surveyor's language exactly which parcels of land are bound by the HOA's rules. If your land isn't in that description, you are not a member. The rules don't touch you. It's that simple and that absolute. We read the original declaration's legal description out loud, lot by lot, checking each against the plat. Simone called the numbers. I tracked the map. My grandfather's 4 acres were not in it. Not in the 1968 declaration. Not in the 1974 amendment. Not in the 1991 amendment. Not anywhere. 40 years of HOA paperwork, and my parcel never once appeared in a single recorded document that would have bound it to Magnolia Ridge. Tom Whitfield was right. Walter was right. The land had never been in it. Simone sat back slowly. Dad, if your lot was never annexed, then you were never a member, which means they never had any authority over you, which means... Every fine was void, I finished. Every notice, the whole lawsuit. They have no standing. But the deed room had one more gift for me, and it was uglier than I expected. While we were pulling records, Simone found a recently recorded preliminary plat, a proposed expansion of Magnolia Ridge into a new 90-home development. A big national builder was behind it, and the proposed expansion swallowed my 4 acres whole. To make the deal work, the developer needed my land inside the HOA, annexed, controlled. Then I cross-checked the names and the room got colder. The county planning commissioner, who'd shepherded that development application through approval, was Gerald Caldwell, Brenda's husband. The same soft gray man who'd flinched when I said the word financial. And the HOA's own reserve account, which Tom's whisper had pointed me toward, was tens of thousands of dollars short, with consulting fees flowing every quarter to a shell company I'd never heard of. I copied the LLC name into my notebook. My hand, I noticed, was completely steady. I sat back in that cold room and finally saw the whole shape of it. The fence was never the point. The fence was the excuse. They didn't want my fence gone. They wanted me gone, harassed into selling or buried in fines until I broke, so they could fold my grandfather's stolen land into a development that would make the Caldwells rich a second time. Simone looked at me pale. Dad, this isn't a fence dispute. This is a land grab. I thought about my grandfather, then driving slow past this very ground, not saying a word the rest of the day. They'd taken it from him, with a smooth voice and a clouded title, and nobody to stand in the way. 60 years later, the same hunger had put on a linen blazer and come for the same dirt. Only this time, the family had a lawyer. This time, the family had kept the receipts. No, I said, and my voice came out steady and low. This is a land grab with a paper trail, and they handed me the paper. I spent the next 3 weeks building a case the way you build a house foundation first, then the frame, then the part everyone sees. The foundation was jurisdiction. That's the boring word that wins quiet wars. A court can only enforce a covenant against someone the covenant actually binds. If I was never a member of Magnolia Ridge, the HOA had no standing to sue me, and the whole case collapsed before we ever argued about fence color. So I assembled the spine of it, my chain of title going back to Ezra, the recorded 1968 plat with my parcel sitting outside the line, and every declaration and amendment that failed to mention my land. Walter Greer gave me a sworn affidavit. We sat at his kitchen table while his old hands spotted and steady-signed beside the notary's stamp. 40 years I drew these lines, he said. Be a fine thing if one of them finally did some good. The ceiling fan ticked overhead, pushing warm air that smelled of his pipe tobacco. He told me stories about my grandfather while the notary packed up, small ones, the kind that put a lump in your throat. Ezra lending a mule, Ezra at a church fish fry, a whole man alive again for a minute at a kitchen table. That was defense. Then I built the offense. I filed a counterclaim, 3 counts. First, the recovery of years of dues and fines the HOA had wrongfully collected from my parcel and from other owners whose lots I now suspected had also never been properly annexed. If they'd charged me for membership I never had, they'd likely done it to others, and I meant to fine them. Second, a demand for a full accounting of that missing reserve money, dollar by dollar, into and out of that shell company. Third, a claim built on the discrimination woven through every notice, the selective enforcement, the our standards language, the inspector who walked my land when he'd never once set foot on a white neighbor's boat-cluttered yard. Then I used discovery like a scalpel. Here's the thing most folks don't understand about a lawsuit. The second you file one, you open yourself up to be searched. I subpoenaed the HOA's bank records directly from the bank, so Brenda couldn't tidy them up first. I subpoenaed the development agreement between the builder and the association. I noticed Gerald Caldwell for a deposition under oath, where the only choices are tell the truth or commit a crime. Simone built the timeline, a giant printout that ran the length of my hallway wall. Every notice, every fine, every recorded document, every dollar that left that reserve account, lined up by date. When you laid it side by side, the story told itself. The fines against me spiked in the exact same month the developer's application landed on Gerald's desk. They got greedy on a schedule, Simone said, capping her marker. It's all right here. There's a lesson in that wall, and I'll give it to you for free, because it saved more good people than any clever argument I ever made. When somebody powerful is doing you wrong, don't chase your anger, chase the dates. Write down what happened and when. Keep the letters, the emails, the receipts, the photos with the timestamps. Memory is a story people argue about. A timeline is a fact they can't. 9 times out of 10, the pattern you can't see while you're living it jumps right off the page once you line it up by date. She learned the trade in real time, the way I once had. Why not just go to the newspaper now? She asked another night. Blow it all up. Because a headline fades by Friday, I said. A judgment is forever. We don't win this in the paper. We win it on the record, under oath, where they can't take it back. She nodded slow, and I watched something click into place behind her eyes. The same thing that had clicked in mine 30 years before. I made copies of everything. 3 sets. One for the court, one for my files, and one sealed envelope I left with a lawyer friend across the county line. Because people who'll steal land sometimes do worse, and a man covers his back. My grandfather lost his acres because he had no record and no lawyer, and no one who'd stand with him. I had all 3. The math had finally changed. The trial date was set. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't post anything. I let Brenda keep believing she was about to crush a fence-building nobody. The most dangerous thing in any courtroom is the man the other side has decided not to take seriously. I'd been that man my whole career. I'd just never enjoyed it quite this much. Of course, when cornered animals can't win clean, they fight dirty. The Caldwells did both at once. Gerald went to work behind the scenes. Suddenly, my building permits needed re-review. A county inspector showed up unannounced to question whether my grading was up to code, an inspection nobody had requested and no rule required. He was polite about it, almost apologetic, scuffing the red clay with his boot. Honestly, Mr. Brooks, I don't know why this got flagged, he admitted. Order came down from upstairs. Upstairs. I knew exactly which office upstairs. I recognized the pressure for what it was. A man with friends in county offices, squeezing the only way he knew how, hoping I'd get tired, get scared, get gone. So I did what I always do. I pulled the inspection records, found the request slip, documented whose name was on the order, and added it to the file. Then I made sure my grading was flawless, because the best answer to a man hunting for a violation is to hand him nothing. Every squeeze they tried left a fingerprint, and I was collecting fingerprints. Brenda went louder. She started a whisper campaign that bloomed into a private neighborhood Facebook group where I became the litigious new owner, suing our beloved HOA. She posted a photo of my fence with the caption, "Blight on our community." People I'd never met, never waved to, called me a troublemaker, a bully, an opportunist. One man said I'd ruin property values for everybody. And then one woman wrote the line that gave the whole thing away, that I was exactly the kind of element this neighborhood was built to keep out. There it was, the quiet part typed out loud with a timestamp and her real name attached. I screenshotted every post, every comment, every reaction. A friend inside the group fed me the ones I couldn't see. Selective enforcement is hard to prove on its own, but selective enforcement plus open animus in writing on a server that keeps records forever, that's not a hunch anymore. That's a pattern. That's a claim. Brenda was building my discrimination case for me and decorating it with a bow. Then it got physical. I came home one evening, headlights swinging across the yard to find my corner fence post knocked clean loose, 3 planks pried off and thrown down in the clay. Fresh tire ruts gouged deep across my grass right up to the line. My chest went hot, and for a second, the lawyer in me went quiet, and the grandson stood up. That fence was Ezra's dream, made of cedar. Somebody had taken a crowbar to it in the dark, the way somebody had taken everything from him in the dark 60 years before. I stood there, breathing hard in the dusk, crickets sawing in the weeds, the broken planks pale against the red dirt. Then the lawyer came back, and the lawyer remembered something. The cameras. I'd put up those cameras months ago. The little red eyes had been watching the whole time, patient as ever. I pulled the footage that night at my kitchen table, the screen glowing blue on my face, my coffee forgotten and cold again. And there it was, clear as daylight, under the infrared. A pickup backing slow up to my line, lights off. 2 men climbing out with a pry bar, glancing around like guilty men do. And in the cab, lit by the dome light for one careless second, checking her phone like she was waiting on a dinner reservation, sat Brenda Caldwell. I sat back in my chair and let out a long breath. I didn't call her. I didn't post it. I didn't do a single thing she'd expect a hot-headed man to do. I just made a copy, dated, it logged the timestamp, and slid it into the file beside everything else. In one careless night, she'd handed me property destruction, a conspiracy of 2 more men, and her own face on camera at the scene. The next morning, I drove to the sheriff's substation and filed a report on the vandalism, calm and complete, with the timestamp and a still frame printed clear. Not because I expected a country deputy to crack a fence case overnight, because a filed report is another dated fact, another brick in the wall, one more thing Brenda could never wish away. The deputy looked at the still frame, then at me and said, "Sir, is that the HOA president in that truck?" I just told him to hang on to the report. He would understand soon enough. Some people, when they're losing, dig faster. Brenda Caldwell had brought a shovel to her own grave, and Lord, she was digging like she meant to reach China. 2 weeks before trial, the Caldwells changed tactics again. They tried to make it all disappear. Bradley Foss called my office smooth as warm syrup and asked if we could resolve this like reasonable people before it gets expensive for everybody. I agreed to a sit-down, not because I needed it, because I wanted to hear what they'd say out loud when they thought they were winning. We met in a beige conference room at his firm, the air conditioning roaring loud enough to feel like weather, a pitcher of water sweating rings onto the laminate table. Brenda came too, in a fresh blazer the color of butter, her chin high, certain she still held every card in the deck. She didn't even look at me when I sat down. To her, I was still furniture that had learned to argue. Foss slid a 1-page agreement across the table with 2 fingers like he was doing me a kindness. The HOA would waive every fine, he said, drop the lawsuit, wipe the slate clean. Generous, his tone implied. All I had to do in return was sign over a narrow strip of my land, an easement along the southwest edge. to resolve the boundary question permanently and put this unpleasantness behind us. I almost laughed out loud. There it was, the whole game in writing, on letterhead, with a signature line. They didn't want the fence gone. They never had. They wanted the land. And not just any strip that stripped the exact southwest edge the developer needed to make the 90-home plan connect to the county road. I'd studied the proposed plat for 3 weeks. I knew that easement the way I knew my grandfather's face. Brenda was about to confirm on paper in front of her own lawyer and witnesses that none of this was ever about fence color or community standards. It was about real estate. It was about money. I read the page slowly twice, letting the silence stretch until the air conditioner was the loudest thing in the room. "Let me make sure I understand," I said. "You'll forgive fines you had no authority to charge on land you have no authority over if I simply hand you the one strip a developer happens to need? Do I have that right?" Brenda's smile thinned to a paper cut. "We're trying to be neighborly, Mr. Brooks. You'd be wise to take it." "I appreciate neighborly," I said. Then I reached out and tapped the small black recorder sitting in plain view in the middle of the table, where it had been the whole time. "Georgia's a one-party consent state, Mrs. Caldwell. I've been recording since I shook Mr. Foss's hand. You just explained the real reason for this lawsuit to a courtroom that hasn't met yet." The color drained out of her face, like water out of a cracked glass. Foss set down his pen very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to sweat. He leaned to her ear and whispered something. She didn't move. She just stared at that little black recorder like it might bite. That same week, Tom Whitfield stopped hiding. He came to my office after dark, sat down heavy in the chair across from my desk, and let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. The fluorescent light hummed over us. "I'm done covering for them," he said, and his voice cracked on done. "Brenda made me move money I knew wasn't right. Told me it was reimbursements. It wasn't. I've got the emails where she told me what to write." He slid a flash drive across the desk and let go of it like he was setting down a weight he'd carried up a mountain. "My granddaddy farmed near yours," he added quietly. "I should have spoken up a year ago." I told him it took more courage to speak late than to never speak at all. He nodded, eyes wet, and for a second the nervous little treasurer looked 10 years younger. Then he told me the rest of it, the part that put the last nail in place. Once the developer's deal closed and my 4 acres were folded in, the Caldwells stood to clear a finder's fee, dressed up as a consulting contract, paid through the same shell company that had been draining the reserve. The fines, the lawsuit, the inspector, the crowbar in the dark, all of it was just pressure applied on a schedule to get me off the land before the closing date. "I kept thinking somebody else would stop it," he said. "I never figured the somebody would be the man they were trying to run off." I had the boundary. I had the books. I had the camera footage, the recording, and now an insider with receipts and a conscience. Every single piece was on the board, lined up, waiting. All that was left to do was the easiest part of all. Let Brenda Caldwell walk into that courtroom still believing, right up to the last second, that she was going to win. The courtroom was full the morning of trial. Word travels in a small county, and half of Magnolia Ridge had come to watch the new man get what Brenda kept promising he'd get. She sat at the plaintiff's table, in navy and pearls, radiant with certainty. Gerald sat in the gallery's front row. I sat alone with my accordion file and my daughter beside me. The room smelled of floor wax and nervous cologne. A ceiling fan turned slow above the bench. I could hear the wooden benches creak as people leaned in to watch. Bradley Foss went first, and he was good, I'll give him that. He showed blown-up photos of my fence on an easel. He read the notices aloud, one after another, all that talk of standards and harmony and architectural review, and painted me as a man who simply thought he was above the rules everyone else lived by. He gestured at me without looking at me. Brenda nodded along to every word, queenly certain her pearls catching the light. A few neighbors in the gallery nodded with her. Then it was my turn. I didn't argue about fence color. I didn't argue about height. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and said, "Your Honor, before we discuss any rule, the court must decide whether this association has any authority over my client's land at all. May I approach?" I handed up 3 documents: the recorded 1968 plat, the original Declaration of Covenants, Walter Greer's sworn survey affidavit. I asked the judge, the Honorable Eleanor Pruitt, a woman who'd read more deeds than Foss had ever seen, to read the legal description in the declaration and find my parcel in it. The room went quiet. Judge Pruitt put on her glasses. She read the plat. She read the declaration's legal description, slow, her finger moving down the page. She read it again. Then she looked up over the rims of her glasses, and she looked straight at Brenda Caldwell. "Mr. Foss," she said, and her voice had changed, "this parcel does not appear anywhere in your client's recorded declaration. Not in the original legal description, not in the 1974 amendment, not in the 1991 amendment, not anywhere." She lifted the survey, looked at it, set it back down. Mr. Brooks's land was never annexed into Magnolia Ridge Estates. Mr. Brooks was never part of this HOA. This board has no standing over his land, none whatsoever. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Foss opened his mouth, then closed it. He shuffled his own papers looking for something that wasn't there, and I watched him realize in real time that his client had never once shown him the one document that mattered. Brenda's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The smile she'd worn for 4 months, the smile from the gravel road, the smile from the press conference, the smile that said, "Our standards," and let everyone fill in the blank. It simply froze, then slid right off her face like it had never belonged there. She turned to Foss. Foss wouldn't look at her. Gerald went gray in the front row and gripped the bench in front of him with both hands. But I wasn't finished. I asked the court to hear my counterclaim. And then, one exhibit at a time, the file came open. The bank records showing the looted reserve, the development agreement with the builder, Gerald's name on the planning approval, the settlement offer demanding my land, the camera footage of Brenda in that truck at midnight, Tom Whitfield's emails, the timeline where the fines spiked the exact month the developer came calling. The district attorney's liaison, who'd come to watch a sleepy fence case, started taking notes very fast. I turned and faced the gallery, faced the neighbors, who'd called me an outsider, an element, a man above the rules. "I spent 22 years as a JAG officer," I said, quiet enough that the room had to lean in. "I've practiced land law for 2 decades. You didn't sue a stubborn handyman, Mrs. Caldwell. You sued a lawyer. On his own grandfather's land." Brenda found her voice at last, half rising from her chair. "Your Honor, he can't just, we have always..." The words tumbled out and went nowhere, and Foss put a hand on her arm to stop her before she dug any deeper on the record. The room came apart in noise. Behind me, one of the families who'd been fined for years was crying. Somewhere, a man said loud enough to carry, "She did the same thing to my mother." Judge Pruitt let the gavel fall once, sharp as a rifle, and called for order. But everyone in that courtroom already knew exactly how it ended. You could feel it move through the benches like a current, the moment a room full of people who'd been afraid of a woman realized all at once that they never had to be. It ended the way these things should, but rarely do. The judge dismissed the HOA's case entirely with prejudice, which means they can never bring it again. On my counterclaim, Magnolia Ridge was ordered to refund every dollar of fines and dues it had wrongfully collected from me and from 4 other families whose lots, it turned out, had also never been properly annexed. People who'd been paying for years got checks they never expected, and a few of them knocked on my door to say thank you, with tears in their eyes. The missing reserve money brought the rest down. The district attorney opened an investigation into the Caldwells, and the bank records and Tom's emails told a story no jury would struggle with. Brenda was removed as HOA president by a membership that had finally seen the woman behind the blazer, and she now faces charges for the funds she moved. The vandalism footage didn't help her either. Gerald resigned from the county planning commission before they could vote him off. The development deal collapsed under the weight of his conflict of interest, and the builder walked away from the whole county. The pearl-white Lexus went up for sale by summer, a hand-lettered sign in the windshield. I heard later that Brenda tried to tell the neighbors it was all a misunderstanding. Nobody much listened anymore. Funny how fast our standards turns into our problem once the paperwork comes out. As for me, I finished the house. I stood on my grandfather's 4 acres on a Sunday evening as the framers nailed the last roof truss, and the smell of fresh-cut pine rolled down off the lumber, clean and sharp. The red clay glowed under a low Georgia sun. Cicadas rang in the tree line, same as the day I bought the place back. Ezra never got to stand here as a free owner of his own land. But I did, and I will. I did one more thing, the thing I'm proudest of. With part of the refund and a good chunk of my own money, I opened the Ezra Brooks Land Rights Clinic, a free legal aid office in a little storefront near the county courthouse. We help families, a lot of them folks whose land was taken or clouded generations ago, the way my grandfather's was. Clear their titles, fight unlawful liens, read the fine print nobody ever read to them, and hold on to what's theirs. The first month, we cleared title for a widow who'd nearly lost 40 acres over a paperwork error from 1979. Walter volunteers 2 days a week, reading old surveys with those steady, spotted hands, and telling anyone who'll listen about the lines he drew. Tom Whitfield keeps our books honestly this time, and sleeps better for it. Simone clerks for us between semesters, and says it's the best classroom she's ever sat in. On the day we opened the clinic doors, I hung one thing on the wall behind the front desk. Not my law degree, not the news clipping about the case. A single photograph of Ezra Brooks, young and lean, standing on these 4 acres in 1958, with his hand resting on a fence post he'd set himself. He's not smiling in it. He's just looking at the camera like a man who knows exactly what he owns. Every family that walks through our door walks past my grandfather first. I like to think he'd be all right with that. Brenda Caldwell thought a fence was about a fence. It never was. It was about whether a man could plant his feet on his own ground and not be moved. My grandfather got moved once by people who counted on him having no record and no recourse. I made sure that the next time anybody tried it in this county on a family like ours, there'd be a lawyer 2 minutes from the courthouse who'd work for free and never, ever look away. I planted mine. So let me ask you the way I asked at the start. Have you ever watched petty power try to take something that was never theirs to take? Tell me your own HOA story down in the comments. I read them, and so does Walter. If this one moved you, subscribe and stay close, because next time I'll tell you about the widow they tried to push off her farm, and the one phone call that turned the whole thing around.
First, if you take one thing from that verse tonight, let it be this: real authority always show you the document, the bluff that show you attitude. Brenda Caldwell ran that neighborhood on the attitude for 9 years, finding people, shaming them, betting nobody would ever ask to see the recorded roll that gave her the right. One man asked. He kept every letter, photographed every note, lined the whole thing up by date, and let her own paper trail do the talking. By the end, she'd locked the board, the lawsuit, the development deal, and a whole lot more besides. Here's the practical lesson for your own life. An HOA can only buy land that's actually written into its recorded covenants. If they can't point the page, they can't enforce the rule. So request the records in writing and keep your receipt. And look what grew out of it. A freelance right clinic helping families hold on what's there. If you've ever been bullied by petty power, tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe and stick around, because next time it's a widow they try to push off her farm, and the one phone call that changed everything.